Welcome to HYPR Live. With our episode today is on mastering MCP, how to give your AI code assistant tools to use. And welcome Daniel, co-host, and Devin, Ryan. I'll pass over to you, Daniel, just for a bit of housekeeping first, and then we'll get into things.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Walters, the founder of Great CTO and a CTO coach. I work closely with Gareth and also Davin. So housekeeping for today. So it'd be great if you can like and subscribe to us on YouTube and on LinkedIn. So you can find us on both platforms streaming live right now. And secondly, feel free to ask questions throughout, but we'll be addressing the questions today at the end because we've got a lot of content to cover with you today. So over to you, Davin. Tell us about yourself.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So I'm a coding architect from HYPR. I actively work as a software engineer, also working on architecture with various clients for HYPR. Some of my work is consulting and delivery practices like test automation, CI/CD, general engineering. Recently getting into AI and how it can influence delivery teams, and specifically how principal and staff engineers can kind of take new innovations in AI and roll them out to teams in a safe and scalable way. Hence my interest in MCP services recently.
Yeah, very cool. And so I think we've sort of got two parts today, haven't we? So we'll do a little bit around just the history of MCP servers and how LLMs have evolved. And then we've got a bit of a demo, which is very cool. So maybe, Devin, do you want to just take us through the generations and the evolution of LLMs and how MCP servers have sort of evolved as well alongside?
Yeah, great. So before I kind of get into that, the reason why I think this is worth talking about is, MCP services, they're very exciting. They make LLMs a lot more capable with very little extra work, which is not how it's been previously. And this makes them more relevant to businesses, makes them more accessible to businesses so that they can leverage these LLMs to improve productivity. So I think it's a pretty big deal and something to not just know about, but understand how they work and how they could potentially benefit you guys. So like Gareth mentioned, I'm just going to give a bit of a bit of history about where we came from, where we are, where we're going, and then I'm going to jump into a little bit of information about why I think MCP service is relevant and what things you should look out for going forward, and then finish with a demo. So
fantastic.
The way I like to do this is originally LLMs by themselves, they're pretty incapable. They can't do a lot. They can kind of predict the next piece of text in a sequence based on lots of training data. You can ask them things like, write me a poem or tell me something about World War II, give me some information on history. And so we kind of refer to this as the first generation of LLMs. And at this point, they're kind of a novelty. They're not really doing a lot. They can't manipulate reality, the environment that we're in. And so the next generation came along where developers kind of figured out how to take LLMs and combine them with tools to do useful things, which leads to productivity improvements. So for example, say every time I get an email, I want to read that email, look out for some specific information, and then shove that into a spreadsheet. Previously, we did that with tools like Zapier, and now we can kind of do those with LLMs. But combining these tools is, that's one thing, but stacking them in a way that's scalable to make them work cohesively together to achieve these things quickly becomes a nightmare. Basically, like I mentioned, LLMs are pretty dumb. These tools do make them a bit more capable, but these tools communicate in various ways. They'll have their own custom protocols, like SDKs, libraries, plugins. Some of them will communicate over REST APIs, and every tool has its own language, protocols, API standards. And these things can change over time and unexpectedly. And you've got to kind of just manage that, which doesn't kind of make them very scalable or accessible to a lot of businesses, like I mentioned before.
Davin, do you think that's why we didn't see lots of examples of tool use with LLMs until now?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the main reason was. We kind of went through this period of time where LLMs came out. There was a bit of fear. Then people kind of got on board with them and wowed by what they could do, and they could generate voices and images. And then all of a sudden, we wanted to start using them with tools, but that was hard. And then it kind of went quiet for a bit. And now MCP's kind of turned up, and there's just been this explosion of excitement and numerous videos on YouTube and other social media outlets talking about MCP services, because it feels like an enabler, kind of like the mouse was like the enabler to the graphical desktop on computers. Once it came along, all of this stuff could suddenly happen.
It's a great analogy. Yeah.
So after this, we kind of got the third generation. That was a natural evolution of LLM with tools. We kind of get this MCP server that sits in between the LLM and these services. And on the left, we have this much simpler, stable MCP protocol. And on the right, we have these more chaotic connections with different services that can change over time. So we can now do things, so like, hey, create me a new entry in my database. And the LLM is connected to that database via an MCP server. It knows exactly what to do and how to do it. It can then communicate with GitHub, tell me about the history of certain code patterns, why those patterns emerged. It can follow up with AWS with some pipelines, or GitHub Actions to tell me where my builds are at. Lots of things that can help you kind of, as a developer, stay in the context of what you're doing. And so this is kind of what the architecture looks like for these MCP services. You end up having this MCP client. In this case, you've heard of Claude Desktop, Windsurf, IDEA has an AI assistant. They communicate usually using 3 different protocols: standard input-output, which is mostly used if you don't want to have a remote MCP server, but something that's local and you don't need to incur the cost of going over a network layer. Then you've got the server sent event, or SSE, which is deprecated and which is being replaced by a streaming HTTP connection. And those MCP services can then be configured using whatever you can program in to talk to various services. So why do we think this is better than what we had before with generation 2? Well, if we go back to that email example, every time that we, say we get an email and we want to update a spreadsheet based on some data in that email, and then we want to, say, send a text message or a Slack message, now imagine that your mail provider or your Slack provider has changed their API, made some updates, it quickly becomes a terrifying nightmare. And the idea is that these MCP services will be owned by those service providers, and they will be able to manage that chaos behind the MCP server, so that when you're making calls to get value, to do specific things, like we just talked about in the example, that stuff's kind of hidden away from you. So the MCP protocol, it's much, much simpler. On the left-hand side, the standard IO, SSE, HTTP, it's just basically events moving backwards and forwards. We've got this ability now where we can do a Lego building stack approach, which is far more scalable than before, because previously we had to hand wire all those tools into the LLM. Now we can just register their MCP services with our LLM using a common language, which everybody has agreed on generally, which minimizes the impact of those LLMs.
Yeah, and they've agreed on it pretty quickly. I think it's been, it's been adopted, and it's obviously still early days, so probably a little health warning with it in terms of how quickly it's been adopted.
Yeah, it's not finalized yet. It's originally released by Anthropic as an open source specification, which is quickly evolving with commands, resources, and prompts in order to be able to make MCP LLMs more powerful and capable. It's very early days, but the noise that you're getting indicates that it sounds like it must be more mature than it actually is.
Well, and there's been a lot of adoption industry-wide, including from competitors as well. So that is normally a good sign for a pathway to becoming the standard.
And that's where I think that's really important, because one of the things that MCP hasn't had is it really hasn't been challenged in a significant way, or the protocol hasn't really been challenged that much. We don't know if it's the right approach or the right thing to do. But if more people are using it, they're kind of voting for it, I suppose. They're investing lots of time. It's obviously solving a valuable problem, and it's not going away. And there doesn't seem to be any other alternatives about.
Hey, I've got a comment from the audience. It's just a comment, so I'm just going to bring it up on screen and we can continue along. So an ex-colleague of mine, Aaron Tan, is sharing about an MCP that he's used, which is the Git MCP, which is a way to wrap GitHub. And so I've used that one. It sounds like Aaron's used that one as well.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, I've even seen MCP services by ServiceNow, which is extraordinary, because that seems like one of the last services that you'd expect to get a fancy MCP server, but there you go. So this kind of leads me into my second to last topic, which I get asked quite a lot, which is, what are some of the challenges and risks and limitations associated with MCP services at the time? Right now. Why aren't they everywhere and being used all the time? Well, like I mentioned, it's a currently evolving situation. It's still not all rainbows and butterflies. A lot of businesses are not, we don't have a finalized standard, so a lot of businesses are still not providing MCP services as a SaaS. They're providing them as Docker images or binaries that you have to download. So you've got customers that need to download lots of files and set up and run these servers locally. We kind of get buggy and unpredictable results due to protocol updates. Like I found that with Claude Desktop, I couldn't use the standard I/O protocol, and with my AI assistant and my JetBrains IDE, I couldn't use the SSE protocol with my AI assistant. And it's going to be really interesting too about how now that we're giving LLMs more power, it's that great phrase, isn't it? With more power comes great responsibility.
Mm-hmm. How
are we going to restrict LLMs from doing lots of damage? How are permissions, authentication, not authentication, authorization is going to be handled? Will the LLM just respond back and say, oops, I couldn't do that because I'm not allowed to? Or will it be clever and say, look, you can't do that, I'm not set up to do that sort of thing? There might be a fourth component which provides data back to the LLM about what it can and cannot get away with. It'll be just really interesting to see where that goes. I haven't seen any examples of it yet. But it's probably going to be pretty important if enterprises are going to get into MCP services in a big way. So keep a watch out for this. So why am I excited about MCP servers? I mentioned a few of these before, that I think that they lower the barrier to entry for businesses, making LLMs more powerful, whether they use on-premise ones or remote LLMs. They're going to be able to get those LLMs to help the developers in ways that they couldn't work before, or even just help their staff in their business access resources that they would normally have to go looking for manually. So this could replace global search in an organization, for example. It could replace onboarding of new developers and engineers, not having to worry about how they work with AWS and work with GitHub. They can just ask their AI agent to do it for them through these MCP services that provide these external tools that the LLM can then go off and do simple tasks with.
This is precisely how I've used it recently. So I had good conceptual knowledge of how GitHub Actions was working, but I didn't know the exact syntax. So working with the GitHub MCP, got me part of the way there, and I could observe what it was doing. So I was also learning at the time of learning the syntax. Getting involved and making adjustments when it was doing something that wasn't exactly the way I wanted to do it, or I thought there was a way that could be more secure. But yeah, it's a great entry point in. It can really lower the learning curve.
That sounds like a pretty good point to maybe jump into the demo and just sort of have a look at what are the parts that you kind of need to assemble and just how simple it can be to put these things together.
Yeah, so let's do that. I've got a little demo that I put together that I'm going to be using Claude as my LLM 3.5. I've got my own little client. Instead of using I could have used a rich Claude desktop LLM tool to type in my queries, but I wanted to use a command line one, which I'll show you in a minute, because it just allows me to show you guys a lot more information about what's going on. And I'm going to use this, in this example, I'm going to be asking Claude questions about, give me the weather for certain countries, states or towns. And it's going to use my MCP server that I've written to go and get this information from api.weather.gov. In this example, I'm just using the standard IO protocol because I don't, this isn't a remote MCP server. It's one that's just running locally. So I don't need the overhead of talking over SSE or HTTP. And I'm using the Model Context Protocol library, I think provided by Anthropic, to write my MCP server to configure it. And I'm going to be using the Anthropic AI SDK in my client in order to interact with my LLM and register my MCP server. So I kind of hope this makes a bit of sense. And we'll just step into the demo.
That sounds great.
Great. So in my window, I've got kind of three parts. In this section here is the code that I'm going to be talking to you guys about. In the left-hand side, this is my folder structure, and this will highlight the file that I'm currently got selected and working on, so that you can follow me through the different files. And most importantly, at the bottom, this is going to be the terminal that I'm going to be using for running the example. And I'm just going to run the example first so that you guys can kind of rationalize what's going on. And then I'm going to ask you to remember a few key things to look out for so that you can find out where in the code these things are happening. So I'm going to start up my server, my client, and this is the Anthropic AI SDK. You can see there's a few things going on here. That I've registered my MCP server that's also running locally, and it's found two tools that it can use to help me answer certain questions about weather forecasts. There's this get forecast function that takes a longitude and latitude, and then will provide you a forecast. And this will be, temperature, whether it's sunny or not. And then there's this function called get alerts, which is going to, you can provide it country codes, state codes, and it can get you general alerts for the area, or general weather alerts. So because this is Claude, I'm just going to write this in plain text, so I can ask it something like, what is the weather for California. If I just, and what it's going to do is it's going to first look at my MCP server tools that are registered and decide whether those can be used, and it looks like it has. And what's nice about using this command line client is that, unlike, you know, like a Claude desktop or another more polished tool, is that I can print out things like this. I can actually see that it's Claude has accepted my input. I can help you with that. Let me check the weather reports, and you can see that it's calling my function with these arguments in my MCP server to get this information. And this is a real API, and it's come back with this information about the, you know, heat, wind, fire, and flood, and special weather statements. And you know, kind of follows up if I'd like more detailed information about anything specific. If I do ask it something a bit more specific about a forecast, you know, so that we show that it can use the other function, I could ask it a question, you know, like what is the weather forecast for, I don't know, Dallas, Texas for the next few days. And if I was more ambiguous, if I said like a state, it would kind of know that the weather would be too vague. And so I think it would actually ask me and complain. But here you can say that, you know, I can help you with that. I'll use the get forecast function, and you can see that it's called it, and it's called it with this longitude and latitude, which it went and figured the longitude and latitude out itself, plugged it into my function exposed by my MCP server, and then provided me this formatted output. And so that's it. So I've just shown you those two functions. That's what I'm going to show you in the code today about how I achieve this. And what I want you to look out for is, you know, how does Claude know how to format this output correctly? So any questions before I continue from here?
I've got some questions saved for later.
All right. So
different things we can try with this.
So I'm just going to kill that server now. I just type quit, apparently. And so I'm not going to focus on the client code because it's pretty standard stuff. I'm just using that SDK to register my MCP server and connect to Claude using an API key. But what I am going to show you is that it will consume this file called API entry. This is where it's going to use this code to create my standard input-output server. And so this is where the magic happens. So if we have a look at this function, we can see that there is 3 things happening in this function. One, we're creating an MCP server using the MCP server SDK from Model Context Protocol. Probably could have given it a better name than my app. That's all right. We're registering some tools. So this is registering the get forecast and get alerts. And then at the end, we're deciding how we're going to serve this MCP server up. It's really flexible. You can serve it up. In this case, I'm using standard I/O, but I've got an SSE example here. If I wanted to use SSE, it's a little bit more complicated. You'll notice that I have exactly the same code at the top, make the server, register the tools, and then I create an express server in TypeScript. And basically I just have to do one thing, which is forward any calls to /SSE to this function here, which it will then pass on to the server.connect function, which will then process the message that was sent. But I'm going to stick with the standard input output for now. And the thing that I want to show you is how we register these tools, because all the stuff is done for you. So you really don't need to know how that kind of works. This is the bit that you need to work on. So if we look at register forecast tool, the MCP server that we created has a .tool function. It also has, you know, a .resource, prompt. Those are the kind of the 3 things that you can add to MCP servers at the moment. And we're going to give it 4 arguments. We're going to give it a name, get forecast. We're going to give it a description. This description is really important because it helps give clues to Claude about when you would use this function. And we're also going to tell Claude or expose in our MCP server what the schema is for the arguments that need to be provided, longitude and latitude, in order to be able to answer this question, to get this forecast. And then the 4th piece that we need to provide is the actual function that does the work. So we're going to accept these arguments that we got given, so that now you imagine that the LLM has looked up get forecast, and it's now going to call this function over my MCP protocol, and it's going to provide these 2 bits of information. We're going to call this website to get there's like a points URL where we can pass it longitude and latitude, and it will provide us some points data. There's a bunch of error case scenarios here, but this points data will have a forecast URL in it. So basically we're taking a longitude and latitude and turning it into another URL that we can then use to get the forecast for that location. And so down here at line 50, we then take that forecast URL, get that data, and this is really important. Whenever we respond to an MCP server request, we always have to use this format. In the case of a tool, we've got a content, type, and text. So this is an error scenario. So let's have a look at when we do actually have forecast data. We come down the bottom here. It's another error scenario. Here we go. So first we're going to format it. And so that answers your question, well, my question that I posed earlier about how does Claude know how to format this stuff? We get to choose, which is kind of nice. So we have the location, temperature, wind, forecast available. And then down the bottom, we use this same message format again. We have to provide the type, it's text, and then the answer, in this case, the forecast text. And that's it.
Something that's interesting about looking at this code is you see a mix of sort of typed inputs as well as, prose. And it's sort of like that's what MCP is. It's at the intersection of deterministic code and your stochastic model as well. And it's like both are there at the junction point.
Yep. And to finish off, if we start right from the top again, create a standard IO server, register the alerts tool. The alerts tool is a bit smaller. Again, it's the same format. 4 arguments. What's its name? What's its description? What are the attributes, parameters that we need to provide, and make sure that we can validate them. And then our function that then takes this state code and then makes a request call to our service to get that data. And then we cover a bunch of error scenarios if we have no data, if there's no alerts for today. And then we can format that alert. The format looks like this. For every alert feature, we're going to specify an event, an error, severity, status, and headline. And then again, like I said before, we're going to return it back to the LLM and via the MCP protocol, where we have to have this format: content, type is text, and the text is the answer, however we want it to be formatted. And if we look at the output, you can see the output and how it's formatted it. In the forecast, we had, the period, the temperature, showers, etc., etc. So that's, we kind of took over control using the MCP server for the output, but we didn't have full control of the input. The input, we got to type in an ambiguous question. Claude figures that out, chooses your MCP server, chooses the right function. We don't have control over that. And then our MCP server decides the format of the answer.
And so you can pretty much wrap any kind of standard API and make it, accessible.
If you can code it in your language of your choice, you can call it. And this package by Anthropic, they've got a Python, Node, C#, Kotlin versions of it. So not a lot of languages, but quite a decent number.
And so, I mean, if you're calling an existing API, how quickly could you put something like this together?
Well, really, it's pretty quick. You know, like if that API is modern and it has a nice clean REST API like the weather API that I was calling, you can do it really, really fast because you really don't need to implement the LLM side of things. That is all given to you through the MCP protocol. The only work that you need to do is previously what we used to do, which was configuring, you know, generation 2, where you had to program your LLM to connect to a tool. Now that we've got this level of abstraction, you don't even need to know how the LLM works. You just have to assume that they can register MCP services, so that complexity is gone, and then you can just write the integration in your language of choice, providing there's a decent SDK around that allows you to do that easily and efficiently.
And you can do that with your AI-assisted development IDE giving you support along the way, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I've got my little AI assistant here where I've been asking it questions and it's been generating code and having conversations with me about building this.
Very cool.
Cool. So, Davin, the output that was that's in a conversation, so that's in the context, right? So if you then ask the model to create a summary of how the outlook for next week in California look like, could it become your virtual weather person?
I suppose it could actually. I mean, I could try that right now. I haven't tried that particular query, but
Yeah,
it does keep context.
Let's give that a shot.
All right, let's fire it up. So I have to start the server again. So what do we want to ask it? Just a particular query?
I'm just putting it on this. Yes, I mean, imagine it's a weather person. So it got data from a few different days, right? So maybe could it describe the outlook for the next few days?
Yeah, so we had Dallas, Texas for the next few days. I'll just make this a bit bigger so we can see it. Here we go. So we've got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday.
All right. And can we ask it to summarize? So the weather person would say something like, it's warm on Thursday and getting cold by Sunday or something like that.
Yep. So can you please, we'll just say, can you please summarize?
Well, whilst that's running, Aaron, who asked the question before, was just asking, you mentioned it works with Claude. Does it also work with OpenAI?
Yeah, at the moment, as long as those agents have their own SDK to make it easy to create clients, that will work from a software point of view. But just generally, anything that can use the MCP protocol that Anthropic open sourced can connect to these MCP services.
And also, with you hooking into Claude in your IDE, then that was just using the model switcher in your IDE?
Oh, yeah. So my IDE, you're talking about, the different LLMs that I can choose from.
Yeah, I was just trying to anticipate what Aaron's question was. Yeah.
So I don't know if you can see my pop-up menu. It doesn't look like it's rendering, but when I click on this Claude 3.7 Sonnet, I actually get a list of different LLMs that I can choose from to have conversations with. Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, 03, 04, 01.
Cool.
So we got a pretty vague response. I can summarize this, but I need more specifics. So we could say, can you please summarize the weather forecast for the next week? So it looks like it doesn't have that context at the moment because I'm not using prompts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it is apologizing. So because we're just relying on tools at the moment, just to keep this example simple, it doesn't have that context of the conversation. What I would need to do is create a prompt, not a tool, called analyze weather or something, and that can create a session with a session ID, and it can hold context about a particular conversation, so you don't have to keep repeating yourself all the time, like, you know, Dallas, Texas and stuff like that. And that can be exposed through an MCP server.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
in this example, that's not going to work unless I use a prompt, but I've written this as a tool.
Yeah. Maybe do you want to share what are some of the current limitations, Devin, or things for people to be wary of if they're implementing their own MCP servers?
Be realistic. This is still a moving goalpost. I found it pretty painful. I found that some protocols work, some didn't with certain LLMs. There's still some maturity going on there. You'll notice that that IDE that I was showing you before, which is IntelliJ, has a AI assistant, or an AI client called AI Assistant, which allows me to connect to ChatGPT and Claude and stuff, and it allows me to register MCP services. But those MCP services, that ability is in beta at the moment, and so I can't even like hook up certain MCP services yet. It'd be interesting, you know, like when they would ever come out of beta for that, because the standard would have to finalize first.
There's a few different ways people can experience MCP. So one of the first places it showed up was on Claude Desktop. So, and there's some, you can just go into the settings, and there's some there's a space there for configuring MCP servers. It's still pretty brittle. It's still, you know, it's very easy to create a configuration that won't run and you get errors. So the way I've been doing it is in my AI assistant IDE, which is I've been using Klein, and the configuration interface for MCPs there is quite easy to use. So you can go and put your details in. It will use its model to actually debug. So even if the configuration has got an issue, it will go and then keep working on it until it's debugged and working for you, which is pretty cool. It makes it much more resilient for configuring it up. So yeah, if someone's wanting to get hands-on with their MCPs, getting into it with your IDE is actually a good option and a good sort of resilient interface.
Yep. Yeah, and maybe that's probably a pretty good point to just maybe speculate a little bit in terms of the future. Where do you see the opportunities, Devin? Like, where do you think this is going to go, and how powerful do you think it's going to be from a development and engineering perspective?
Well, I think there's opportunities for two different types of person. So if you're a technical person, MCP application services have a huge ability to reduce the cost of onboarding and interacting with the company's services or tools that they use. Normally that requires two things. One, you need to have the knowledge about the tools that a company is using, and then two, you need to be able to step over all their access, their restrictions, policies, But if all that can be done and set up for an AI, and the AI is essentially being a proxy person that was painfully onboarded some long time ago, and it can serve a whole bunch of developers that all of a sudden don't need as much access, because the LLM is constrained in what it can do, because it's you just need access to like a developer persona LLM, then I think that's going to be a bit of a game changer. I think a great opportunity for developers too is that you could make your own app stores for MCP services, where you got one click install and configure. We're already seeing this with IDEs. They have their own plugin stores. And with IntelliJ, or the IDE that I use, I was able to install a MCP server plugin and straight away into my environment that exposed my code base and my development environment features to Claude Desktop, like an LLM client running on my computer. So LLMs could have access to my coding features outside of my IDE, which is pretty interesting. So I think it's also going to help technical people with their ability to boost their productivity. Like I mentioned before, once you've got access to things like GitHub and pipelines and GitHub Actions, common things that developers often have to do 20, 50, 100 times a day is, my build's broken, my test's failing in a pipeline, are my things being deployed? And often we have to leave the context of our IDE to go and check on that stuff. But if we can stay in the context of our IDE, ask our agent to go and figure all that stuff out for us, it kind of reduces the number of distractions. I think for a business person, I think, pay close attention to the standard once it gets finalized. And, that'll be the time to really start investing in this type of thing and strike for a business opportunity. It's important right now to understand how MCP services work. So it'll help you understand how the next thing works, and then you can kind of hit the ground running. And that would kind of be my advice to those two groups of people.
Yeah, and so MCP servers, as it is at the moment, with a pretty fast evolving kind of standard around, is it production ready? I mean, I guess there are a lot of organizations that are implementing these things. How do we feel about the production readiness in terms of if you wrote your own one and started to implement it or use it in your own workflows?
Well, it's not production ready, but the thing I would consider is that the things that would change that aren't production ready are the SDKs or the libraries that you use in order to create your own MCP services, and those basically when the spec does get finalized and changes do happen, you just have to update your package, and there's just going to be some changes to that interface. But so the way that I think about this is that it's going to be really disruptive and risky for you if you're building your own MCP services. But if the idea with MCP services is that in an ideal situation, you don't need to build them. They're owned by the service owner. So that service owner would be GitHub, AWS, or ServiceNow, Trello, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's up to them to maintain it for you. And you don't maintain the LLM either. And so so if you're not building your own MCP services, the barrier to entry is very low, the risk is very low, and that production readiness kind of goes a little bit higher. You're just at the beck and call of how quickly the service providers get around to making changes when the standard does happen, and how quickly those LLMs get around to adopting that new standard. Like I mentioned earlier, I came across many issues, and certain AI assistants that I was using couldn't use certain protocols. So to be clear, it's not production ready, but it's worth having a play with at the moment.
Yeah,
so In terms of production readiness, I wouldn't deploy them into a SaaS product, for instance. But I think there are MCP servers that I would comfortably use in a development environment for AI-assisted development. A lot of the onus, you have to do your research though, because a lot of the onus is on the MCP service creators as to are they implementing authorization and other. So yeah, some of the servers are very simplistic and not robust at all, and haven't implemented any of that, and therefore could be a vulnerability for you. And some are now many point versions in and quite reliable to use in a development context. So.
And maybe that's the guidance, right? Is that if the risk exposure is low, then go for it. But if the risk exposure is high, I think that's where the maturity still needs to come along, where I talked about permissions and authorization, making sure that the MCP server doesn't allow the LLM to do too much damage in a high risk exposure.
Yep.
I'm interested, Devin, what are some of your favorite MCPs that you're sort of using on a regular basis?
Definitely the file system one, where I can basically register a library with my coding and tool, and it uses the standard I/O because it's a MCP that runs locally, and it can access my entire computer to get information, find stuff for me. I really like the GitHub one. GitHub's created an MCP server. They don't offer it as a SaaS at the moment. It's just running as a binary or a Docker container that you can run, and it allows you to get your LLM to do really neat things with GitHub, like analyze Git history, check on things like GitHub Actions if you've got GitHub Action pipelines, find the status of builds, deployments. Whereas previously I used to kind of log into it, GitHub, and navigate my way to find those pipelines and find out what was going on. So those are really big time saves. And I haven't played with it yet, but I'd like to try out the ServiceNow and MCP server. It looks like it's pretty rudimentary, but dealing with ServiceNow is something that a lot of companies deal with on a regular basis for their security approvals. When deploying their artifacts and their software to production, it has to go through some type of approval process, and ServiceNow is typically a very common tool that's used in that. And one of the trickiest things you can do is get low risk deployments through to production, because a lot of deployments, they work in such a way that everything's high risk. And wouldn't it be great if you could use an LLM to create a ServiceNow using a low risk template and fill it all out for you? Because there's a lot of fields in that tool. It's very complex, very time consuming. It can take 2 hours to fill out a form sometimes. The LLM can have access to the code, provide the code references, the testing reports, and all the stuff to prove the validity of, that checks and balances and compliance have been achieved. So I think that's going to be a really, really big sweet spot for LLMs in my world with development, because getting production is sometimes one of the hardest things you can do in enterprise companies.
Give us those MCP servers for various attestation tools that could really save us a lot of time. We've got a contribution from Aaron, who said his favorite is Context 7, which was one I was going to mention. So that connects you with documentation and for languages and particular versions, and it highlights the point that you can feed context into your AI assisted development environment. So rather than try and load in everything through RAG, you can load what you need through interfacing through these MCP servers. So that's super powerful for AI assisted developers.
Nice.
Cool. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good place to conclude for today. But yeah, thanks so much, Devin. There's some great stuff in there, and really, I love the demo as well. Nice to see some hands-on examples and some practical implementations, and keep people's imaginations going in terms of where some of these things can be applied in their own context.
Davin, where can people find you?
Yep. So I've got my LinkedIn address. Thanks for sharing that. I actually really use that quite a lot. It's a primary way to contact me. I love to get your messages. If you want to discuss this stuff, talk more about it, please don't feel worried about sending me a message on LinkedIn. I'll be more than happy to jump in there and help you out.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, and thanks, Daniel, for co-hosting, and we'll see everybody again next week.
Cool. And if you want to talk about AI, or if you've got some gnarly AI challenges, or looking to get people interested in AI within your business context, come and have a chat to us at HYPR. All right. So we'll see you next time. See you next week.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.